All right, let's take a look at section 2. And here's the focus question. George Washington was reelected unanimously in 1792, but in 1796 he decided to retire from public life, and he set a precedent that the presidency should not be a lifelong office. In his farewell address, Washington warned against parties and partisanship and urged Americans to avoid Europe's power politics by refusing to embrace permanent alliances with other nations. The election of 1796 was the first contested presidential election. John Adams, with Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina, ran for the Federalists, and Thomas Jefferson, with Aaron Burr of New York, ran for the Republicans. Although Adams won the presidency with the most electoral votes, Jefferson received more votes than Pinckney, so he became Adams' vice president. Adams was brilliant, but was disliked by nearly everyone, even his supporters, and his administration faced constant crisis. Although the United States was neutral in the war between France and Britain, it defended its right to trade non-military goods with both nations. In 1797, before negotiating the renewal of France's treaty with the United States, French officials demanded bribes. Outraged, Adams publicized their demand, which was thereafter known as the XYZ Affair, and soon U.S. and French ships were engaged in a quasi-war at sea. America had effectively become an ally of Great Britain in the European War. In 1800, Adams negotiated a peace with France. Less cautious in domestic affairs, Adams used the Federal Army to quell more resistance to taxes in backcountry Pennsylvania, this time in the form of Fry's Rebellion. John Fries was arrested for treason after leading a crowd to release arrested men from prison, and the Army terrorized his supporters, tore down liberty poles, and whipped Republican newspaper editors. While Adams pardoned Fries in 1800, the region never voted Federalist again. The most controversial act of the Adams administration was the Alien and Sedition Acts, passed by a Federalist-dominated Congress in 1798. The acts made it harder for immigrants to become naturalized citizens and allowed the deportation of immigrants deemed dangerous by federal authorities, moves meant to silence immigrant radicals who supported the Republicans and the French. They also authorized the prosecution of any assembly or publication critical of the government. This was meant to allow federal authorities to suppress Republican newspapers attacking the Adams administration and its policies. Jefferson, referring to the Salem witch trials, believed these acts inaugurated a reign of witches. More than a dozen individuals were charged with sedition, many of whom were convicted, including Matthew Lyons, a Republican member of Congress. Instead of squelching the opposition, the Alien and Sedition Acts only provoked its growth by calling into question the boundaries of free speech and sparking a heated debate based on the First Amendment. Madison and Jefferson drafted resolutions to be passed by the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures. Both criticized the acts as violation of the First Amendment. The original draft of Jefferson's resolution asserted that states could unilaterally stop the enforcement of such laws within their borders, but the Kentucky legislature deleted this passage before passing its resolution. While many Americans were repelled by the idea that states could refuse to follow federal laws, more Americans believed that the Alien and Sedition Acts violated protections for free speech enshrined in the Constitution. No other state adopted the resolutions, and many Americans, including Republicans, feared the consequence of state action that might endanger the Union. The crisis did, however, reinforce the idea of freedom of discussion as an indispensable attribute of American liberty and democratic government. By 1800, Republicans had developed effective campaigning techniques to mobilize voters for their candidate and cause. Federalists, who viewed politics as an activity of only the elite, found it difficult to match their opponents' mobilization. Jefferson won the election of 1800 over incumbent John Adams, but even before he was inaugurated, a constitutional crisis had to be worked out. Each party arranged to have an elector throw away one of his two votes for president so that its presidential candidate would come out a vote ahead of their vice presidential candidate. When the designated Republican elector failed to do so, Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr tied. The election was thrown into the Federalist-controlled House of Representatives, where neither candidate received a majority vote until Alexander Hamilton tipped the balance. Though Hamilton was an outspoken opponent of Jefferson, he believed Jefferson was enough of a statesman to recognize that the Federalist financial system could not be entirely dismantled. On the other hand, he believed Burr to be a power-hungry potential tyrant. The crisis led Congress to pass the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, requiring electors to cast separate votes for president and vice president. Additionally, the incident sparked a chain of events leading to a duel between Burr and Hamilton 4 years later that would result in Hamilton's death. Burr was later tried for treason after allegedly engaging in a plot to form a new nation in the West from lands detached from the United States and the Spanish Empire. After his acquittal, he went into exile in Europe, eventually returning to live out the rest of his life practicing law in New York. The events of the 1790s demonstrated that a majority of Americans believed they had a right to play an active role in politics, express their opinions freely, and contest government policy. Though Federalists remained overwhelming elitists, they never contested the election results and established a precedent of peaceful transfer of power from one party to another after elections. Slavery lurked in the background of debates in the 1790s. Jefferson was elected only because he received all of the South's Electoral College votes. Jeffersonian liberty rested on the fact that three-fifths of the enslaved people were counted in apportionment. If it had been otherwise, Adams would have been reelected in 1800. The first Congress received petitions for the abolition of slavery, including one signed by Benjamin Franklin. Madison and other political leaders, even though they found slavery distasteful, believed that it was too divisive to be made an issue in national politics, and they ignored the petitions. In 1793, to implement the Constitution's fugitive slave clause, Congress enacted a law providing for local officials to facilitate the return of escaped enslaved people. The Haitian Revolution demonstrated how slavery shaped and warped American freedom. Jeffersonians who celebrated the French Revolution as an advance for liberty were horrified by the slave revolt in 1791 in Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, which was France's most treasured colonial possession, an island of sugar plantations in the Caribbean. The enslaved people defeated British and French forces sent to suppress the rebellion, and they declared an independent nation in 1804. The revolt affirmed the universal appeal of freedom in this age of revolutions and fostered hopes of freedom among America's enslaved people. Whites were generally terrified by the specter of armed slave insurrection, and they interpreted the turmoil in Haiti as a sign that blacks could not govern themselves. Ironically, the Adams administration encouraged the independence of Black Haiti, hoping American merchants could replace the French in the sugar trade, while Jefferson's administration sought to isolate and destroy the hemisphere's second independent republic. In addition to Jefferson's revolution, the year 1800 witnessed an attempted real one during which enslaved people rebelled in a bid for freedom. Richmond blacksmith Gabriel Prosser and his brothers Solomon and Martin planned to march on the city, intending to cut it off from the surrounding plantations. During the rebellion, some white inhabitants were killed, and others, including Governor James Monroe, were held as hostages until the demand for abolition was met. Gabriel hoped that poor whites would join the movement, and he ordered that Methodists, Quakers, and French people be spared, considering them to be potential sympathizers. When a storm washed out the roads to Richmond, the rebellion was discovered, its leaders arrested, and 26 enslaved people, including Gabriel, were hanged, while dozens of others were removed from the state. Blacks made up half of Richmond's population in 1800, 20% of which were free. The rebellion was rooted in a black community that had emerged in this population during the 1780s and 1790s. Gabriel recruited supporters at Black Baptist churches, funerals, barbecues, and other gatherings. Many of the enslaved people in Richmond were literate and hired themselves out to work for wages that would go to owners, elements of autonomy that account for enslaved artisans' role in the rebellion. Gabriel's rebellion was a product of the age, and participants spoke the language of liberty forged during the American Revolution. Adopting many of the symbols and figures of the Revolutionary era liberty, the rebellion demonstrated that enslaved people longed for liberty and freedom as much as anyone. In the wake of the rebellion, Congress moved in the opposite direction of freedom, tightening control over the black population, restricting individual slaveholders' rights to free their slaves, and slamming shut the door to manumission opened by the American Revolution. So, that's section 2. We'll go with section 3 here in a minute.